Thank you for coming out on this kind of chilly evening to talk about climate change. It's all extremes. I love the people that say, well, it's cold today. There can't be any global warming. So here we have a really interesting and important speaker coming to talk to us about an aspect of climate change, or global warming, as I prefer to call it, that maybe hasn't received as much attention as environmental impacts of climate change, and that is economic impacts of climate change. And in terms of effecting change in our society, this is probably an extraordinarily important aspect that people have to be made aware of. And if you saw the business section in the Sunday New York Times, when do you expect to see the entire front page of the business section devoted to climate change? So this tells you that people like Mark Shapiro and others who are bringing attention to the economic impacts of climate change, how it's going to impact business, are making a lot of noise and getting a lot of deserved attention. So I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Judy Storch. I'm one of the campus deans for the Cook campus, one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event. The main sponsor is the Rutgers Climate Institute, and but importantly, we have a number of graduate student groups and undergraduate student groups that are also sponsoring this event, and I really want to commend the student body at Rutgers for taking on this issue so forcefully and importantly. And so our student sponsors are the Environmental Sciences Graduate Student Association, the Oceanography Graduate Student Association, the Students for Environmental Awareness, thank you, and the Rutgers Fossil Fuel Divest movement. So I'm not going to be the one that's introducing our speaker tonight. We have Professor Robin Lechenko, who is a professor in the geography department at the School of Arts and Sciences. And Robin is an expert in the economic impacts of and human dimensions of global climate change. And so this is very much, the topic of tonight's talk is very much within her area of expertise. She has served on national panels that evaluate programs involved in climate change, and she is the editor of a journal named Urban Climate. So if you'll help me welcome Robin. And one other thing I want to mention is that after Mark Shapiro is finished talking tonight, there'll be a book. He's going to be talking about stuff in his book on climate shock, and you can buy the book and get it signed after the talk. So please welcome Dr. Robin Lechenko to introduce Mark Shapiro.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out. I know it's always, a little bit of an extra effort to come out to things on school nights, that I call them. So I really appreciate the turnout. And I also want to reiterate our thanks, not just to our main organizers, but for all the students who helped and all the volunteers sitting out and signing people in and really kind of making these events possible. So I'm in addition to being a professor in geography, I'm also the co-director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. And this is our second major sort of journalist-type speaker that we've brought in this year. And so it's really a pleasure. These seem to be really popular events and events that seem to really reach a wide audience. So I'm very appreciative of the work that goes in and also having such a good audience. But let me just give a quick introduction for Mark. He's an investigative journalist whose work looks at the intersections between environment, economics, and international political power. He's had writings that have appeared in many major magazines and newspapers, magazines including Harper's, The Atlantic, Yale 360, The Nation, and a number of other publications. And his most recent book, which we're going to be hearing about tonight, and I also have a copy, Carbon Shock, is a book really focusing on as we'll hear, many of the economic dimensions of climate change, and many of the dimensions that I think are kind of surprising and unexpected, and I'm not going to say any more because that's what we're going to be hearing about, but I think you're definitely going to hear some things tonight that you probably haven't heard before and that you probably haven't even thought about before. He's also written another book called Exposed: The Toxic Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. And in addition to all of this excellent journalism and excellent books, as a result, he's won numerous awards, including a Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award, a DuPont Award, the Society of Environmental Journalists Reporting Award, a National Magazine Award, and a Kurt Schork Award for International Reporting. Wow, that's a long list of awards. Mark's also an adjunct professor currently at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and he's also a lecturer at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. So without further ado, let me welcome our speaker.
Okay, great. Good to be here. Get a little bit of water here. It's my first time really to Rutgers. It's been a really interesting day, actually, to figure out what your climate institute is trying to do and bring all these people together from different disciplines. You have like scientists meeting sort of environmental accountants, meeting physicists and astronomers, and I actually think that that's where the action is when it comes to climate change, which is ultimately the most interdisciplinary field you could possibly come up with, which is one why it's so urgent of our time. It's also endlessly fascinating to actually try to comprehend and grasp and study the various aspects of climate change. And I certainly approached this topic that way as a journalist in trying to understand the multiple levels at which we can understand climate change. So like Robin said, I actually set out several years ago to, is that okay? To document the economic, it might be these two feeding off each other. Yeah. To document the economic implications of climate change, which I felt had not been just totally understood. It's very gratifying to see things like this idea coming out in the Sunday New York Times and elsewhere, because I think it's obviously something being picked up on. I started writing this book a couple of years ago, and now it just came out a couple of months ago. To actually get at the heart of that issue, I want to actually tell you a story about a rock. And for those of you, hopefully you can tell what I'm holding here. I'm holding a rock, a very simple rock. It's not any more complicated. It's spelled R-O-C-K. And the only difference, the only difference between this rock and the rock that you might have in your front yard, it's about the size of my fist, and it happens to be coated with oil. This rock is coated with black oil that I took from a beach in northwest Spain in the province of Galicia. I don't know if anybody here knows about Spain. Northwest coast of Spain. On a torrential winter night in November 2002, the waves were crashing at like 30-foot waves along the Costa del Muerte, off the coast of northwest Spain. Where is that? That's right where Spain, you know, the bend of Spain where you go around from Ireland and then you turn around the corner from Spain, you start heading south towards Ireland. That opening to the North Atlantic is known in Spanish as the Costa del Muerte. It's where a lot of Spanish galleons sank. And if you feel like diving, 2,000 feet to the bottom, you could probably find some Spanish gold down there. But one evening in November 2002, a single-hull oil tanker coming by the northwest coast of Spain, there off the coast of Galicia, caught up in a massive winter storm where the kind of waves were crashing at 30 feet high, treating the boats there like a toy. They all looked like toy boats according to people who were there. And in the middle of this storm came the Prestige oil tanker. It's called the Prestige. And that oil tanker broke in half. And up from the hull of that tanker, what's that? Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. How's that? Okay. Maybe we just need to turn this thing off. So can people hear me now? You got the oil tank, you got the ocean, you're like massive, you're getting seasick. It's like an enormous winter storm that's happening off the northwest coast of Spain. And in the middle of this storm, this is in November 2002, the tanker, oil tanker, sinks. Out from its belly comes 39,000 tons of oil. Comes washing onto the coast of Spain. Ultimately covers about 1,000 miles all the way up to the coast of France. Comes the oil from the belly of this oil tanker. And I went to the coast of Spain at that time to do a story on this oil tanker and what set it off to sea and why it sank and what the backstory was to this tanker. I did a story for a television show called Frontline. It's called Frontline World. And I was interested in what brought that tanker out to that evening. And so I went onto the beaches, and I looked at where this oil ended up, and I stood out on these remote beaches. These are not the kind of beaches you go to in Atlantic City or the types of beaches anybody goes to in a bathing suit or a bikini or anything. This is like rugged, rocky, windy, cold, freezing, isolated North Atlantic beaches, which that day I will never remember. 6 months after the spill, in every direction were coated with this black gunk of oil that came from the Prestige. And out there in the middle of absolute nowhere, in the North Atlantic, it smelled like a gasoline station. And I've never forgotten that experience. And so at that time, and this was about 10 years ago, I took this rock. I took this rock off the beach and I put it in my pocket because I never wanted to forget that sensation of what it meant to have oil defiling the landscape in this kind of way. And I never quite knew what I would do with this rock. I just knew I wanted to remember it. It was my talisman of that experience. Because I'll also never forget looking at all the volunteers who sat there hopelessly scratching at the boulders trying to get the oil off of the rocks. And when I started looking into climate change, which happened several years later, I did a couple stories on this kind of oil disaster, I realized that this rock, this experience on the coast of Spain was a symbol. This is a representative of climate change. It's so difficult to actually visualize what climate change actually means. Are greenhouse gases visible? No. For the most part, you actually can't see greenhouse gases. These are not the kind of gases that cause acute pollution, that cause asthma, and et cetera, et cetera. These gases are, for the most part, invisible. The action that happens up in the atmosphere, largely invisible. We don't even know how to really comprehend it. And so when you think of climate change, I wanted you to think about this rock and the oil that remains on this rock 10 years later. And it's sat above my desk now for 10 years to remind me what this whole story is all about. Because what else does this rock tell us about climate change, about the essential qualities of climate change? Number one, the oil, the oil, that was perfect. The oil that came from that tanker actually came from nowhere. The oil was actually owned by a Russian oligarch. The ship was owned by Greek oligarchs, who were rich Greek ship-owning family. The ship itself was flying the flag of the Bahamas. As you know, ships basically can buy flags from anywhere, and they put their flag up, and it means nothing in terms of the regulation. Running the flag of the Bahamas, and it was registered in, guess where it was registered? In the big, thriving metropolis, sorry? Thank you. This gentleman knows. In the country of Liberia, which has one of the most sophisticated environmental monitoring system on the face of the earth, as you probably know. So it turns out that 2/3 of the oil tankers on the ocean today are registered in Liberia. Why is that important? Number one, because another thing about climate change is 10 years have gone by, 10 years have gone by, the amount of devastation on that coast in Spain was, the marine ecology was devastated, the tourist economy was devastated, nobody could sell fish out of that area any longer. It's a rich, used to be a rich fishing zone. Billions and billions and billions of euros spent to clean up those beaches. And who had to pay for it? Did the owners of the ship pay for it? No, because the owners of the ship had registered it in Liberia, and therefore there was no mechanism. And of course, they had a one-ship company. This is they owned one. They registered one ship with one company in Liberia, and where was the ship? At the bottom of the ocean. So with this trick of accounting, nobody was ever held responsible for the damages. 6 billion euros, which is about $10 billion, caused by that one ship traveling across that one area in northwest Spain. Does that remind you of something? Climate change. What happened to the cost for the cleanup of those beaches in Spain? What's that? Social cost. The people of Spain and the people of Europe, in this case, actually had to pick up those ship, not the owners of the oil. So somebody pays for those costs, and this is what I want to talk about when it comes to climate change, because this rock is representative of the fundamental question of climate change. It's who pays for the costs of fossil fuels. And this is known in economic terms as, and those of you who study environmental studies will know it as externalized costs. Those who study the economists, this is such a common phenomenon that the economists have even come up with a term for it. They call it externalized costs. What does externalized costs actually mean? It means we buy a good, but we don't pay the actual cost for that good. The company makes the profit on the good, and we bear the risk in terms of the financial risk. The externalized cost means that we, the public, the society, pay for the costs of the consequences of our use of a particular good. And so I'd like to think of, one way to think of climate change is that we are unleashing an oil spill like that a day into the atmosphere. What's the only difference between the oil that came out of the belly of that Prestige and the oil that I put in my 14-year-old Saab in California, or you put in your own, whatever car you drive here in New Jersey? The only difference is that this oil didn't take a little diversionary run through my gas tank to run a car. It ended up straight on the oil on the beaches of Spain and then sort of contaminated the atmosphere. That's the only difference between the oil on this rock. So we're unleashing a spill every day along those lines into the atmosphere is one way to think about climate change. And so my book, I set off essentially to actually identify and begin to understand what the consequences are and what the costs are of climate change in a way that we haven't understood before. Why? Because those goods are, because those costs are hidden. They're not identified as climate costs. We call them something else. And what do we call them? Well, I give you one word for it. What's that? Sorry? Turn this off. They can't hear? Oh, Jesus. Some blah, blah, blah. Okay. How's that? Woo! Okay. Okay. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Jesus, so sorry if you missed anything. Was people basically able to hear? Yeah. Okay, good. So, so what do we call the cost of climate change? I set off in writing this book to actually begin to understand the economic consequences of climate change, because I think that is a huge part of this whole picture that we have not understood. And the economy that we're operating under right now creates a false sense that fossil fuels are less expensive than renewables. It's fundamental to actually understand what the actual costs are of fossil fuels in order for, as a society, to move forward and make some educated decisions as to what based on the actual costs of fossil fuels. What are the real costs that the society pays, meaning society is like us, you and me and every other taxpayer out there, paying for the cost of fossil fuels. So I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. There's an environmental accounting firm which I recommend those of you studying this issue to be aware of, if you don't already, called Trucost, which is a British accounting firm. There's a lot of environmental accounting. And they did a study for the United Nations where they concluded that the 3,000 biggest companies in the world, this is not very many companies, 3,000 of the biggest companies in the world cause $2.1 trillion in annual environmental costs, meaning the amount of costs that are not reflected in the cost of the good that they produce. And most of those costs are related to climate change. What do those costs look like in this country? What are the names they go under in this country? They go under a different name. What are the names they go under in this country? Thank you. Well, we got Superstorm. You guys experienced Superstorm Sandy. Everybody knows that climate change does not cause storms. We all know that. That's completely clear. But what we also know is that climate change dramatically intensifies the impact, the breadth, the depth, the intensity by which storms strike, and their duration. That is absolutely clear. And so a significant portion of Sandy can be attributed to climate change. So when we talk about the cost of climate change, we should say Sandy. We should also say what else? What? Drought, thank you. Yes, I was going to get to drought. Yes, drought. What is the government program, one of the government programs which the government of the United States itself says is on the brink of fiscal peril in terms of its integrity right now? Almost. Flood insurance, actually, that's half right. Flood insurance is correct. It's actually one. The one I was thinking of, which I think may be a little more surprising, is crop insurance. So what's happened over the last 5 years in the food systems of the United States? Well, what you've had is droughts, massive droughts in the Midwest and in California where I live. I came out here to New York. I was like, oh, wow, nobody cares about how much water they use. It's totally different in California, where some cities are actually starting to have rationing of water. So remember that if you come to California. Massive drought across the Midwestern food-growing areas. Massive drought across the California food-growing areas. Who pays for that? We do, thank you. The public, we have a system here called crop insurance, which of course is a federally subsidized program of crop insurance. The payments related to climate-related phenomenon have skyrocketed over the last 10 years, largely due to the inadequate water supplies and the extraordinary heat. So I'll give you an example of the impact. So, and this, and I write about this in my book, of this report that came out, which describes the kind of perilous state of the crop insurance system because of this situation. I went up and down the Central Valley in California. It was actually amazing to see the impact of climate change on one of the central food-growing areas of this country. If you're eating kind of nuts or berries or some tree crops here in New Jersey, they very probably come from the Central Valley in California. And you drive up and down this area, as I did several times, and talk to farmers about the conditions that they're facing. What's really amazing is, number one, many farmers are essentially, these are large farms in the Central Valley, some of the breadbasket of the United States of America. They export to this part of the country as well as all over the world, and massive tree farms of almonds and peaches and cherries and oranges, and it's a huge abundance. And one after another, the farmers I would go visit, who were just these kind of mainstream farmers, they weren't organic, they were conventional farmers, and I'd go like, well, what's going on here? And they would say, I don't know, you know, the weather here has been unlike any other time, and my father, my grandfather, What's interesting is, as you probably have guessed, in California, maybe the same as New Jersey, farmers are fairly conservative politically. The word climate change tends to scare a lot of people off because they think that means regulation. So, but what was interesting over and over again is they would say something like, essentially, I don't know if it's climate change, whatever you know, down here from wherever want to call it, you can call it whatever you want, but things are changing out here. The weather's getting weird, the water's not falling as it used to, and over again. So what does that mean? That means actually that the yields of crops have been steadily declining, which means that, that the price for food is rising, and the price for insurance is rising. And if you look, actually what's interesting is we have in California the cherries. I don't know if you I don't know if you grow cherries here. I know you have a tree crop, tree crops here in New Jersey. I know in California we have a lot of cherries, center of cherry production. And you go into these areas and they're just beautiful with all these beautiful white blossoms, and you know, this is cherry country. Go down to Washington, D.C., see a lot of cool cherry trees and stuff. We have that in the Central Valley in California, and it's been a tradition every May to basically go down there and get these big baskets of cherries with the little white blossoms and everything. Well, what's happened over the last 5 to 10 years is more and more of those cherry trees are getting distorted. So you go out there, and I went out with some farmers, including the guy who's the head of the Cherry Advisory Board. He's not some radical environmentalist. He's been growing cherries for 3 generations. And he shows me, he says, see those blossoms up at the top of the tree? Well, those blossoms, that's what you see, and it looks beautiful when you drive by, and it's a lovely sight. He said, but look at the middle of the tree. Look at the bottom third of the tree. And you can see the middle of the tree with these half-formed blossoms coming out, just struggling to get out. And then you saw the bottom third of the tree where there were no blossoms whatsoever. And he said that is the effect of what's called the lack of a low chill, right? Because tree crops, agricultural people here probably know this better than I do even, but tree crops need a period of cold in order to come out and ripen several months later, every December. They're supposed to get cold so they can kind of almost hibernate, preserve their resources, and in March they come out explosively with all their beautiful blossoms and fruits. Well, that cold has been dramatically reduced by around a quarter in the northern part of the San Joaquin Valley, which is leading to distorted cherries, even those double cherries, which sometimes you get as a sign of kind of extreme climate stress. And so the yields have been dropping of cherries, the price is going up. And so I think the way to understand climate change is that every step of the way you've got these costs that are beginning to creep upon us, and they're beginning to hit people at every stage. And so I like to think of this. There was kind of a incredible, there's an incredible installation in the Copenhagen climate negotiation, which I happen to go to, and which probably you're learning about in your classes as somewhat of a failed endeavor, although I hesitate to say failed because there were a few things that did happen. But broadly speaking, it was not a raging success. What's interesting is the Danish Energy Agency implanted. It's freezing. It was December. It was colder even than here. And in this kind of freezing, icy, bone-chilling atmosphere, the Danish Energy Agency had created a kind of an installation of a huge balloon that was about 1 square block wide, 1 square block in area. And this enormous balloon had across it the words, huge words emblazoned, 1 ton of CO2. So this was basically the size, the volume of 1 ton of CO2, right? Because how do you see CO2? We can't see it usually. So they helpfully provided us an enormous balloon to understand what the size and the volume is of the CO2 we're sending into the atmosphere. So we send up about 50 billion tons of CO2. I think it was last year, about 50 billion tons. So I like to actually try to understand climate change by imagining, take that balloon and imagine it full of money. That's what we're doing. We're sending up 50 billion balloons packed with money. And who benefits from that particular equation? The fossil fuel companies. Because we, the public, and when I should be more specific in terms of money, the money that's in those balloons is the public's money, is the public's resource, is part of our common shared resources. And so the fundamental challenge of this international community and our own country and this state and every one of us is to begin to find a mechanism for assigning the proper price for carbon, for greenhouse gases. We call it, for shorthand, we call it carbon, which is why I call this book Carbon Shock, is to find a mechanism for assigning a price to carbon that actually reflects its cost to society. And when we do that, I think it's actually really important. Number one, when you actually look at the negotiations that just concluded in Lima, when you look at the negotiations upcoming in Paris, this is the fundamental question that the world is debating now. And so when you think, I would add one thing to that, because I think it's actually fundamental that as we come up towards etching a price for carbon into the global economic order, and this is where we get cap and trade, this is where we get discussion of a carbon tax, which I won't go into in all detail now. I think you're familiar with these basic principles, that there's a fundamental question of equity here, because the price of energy is going to increase. And the question is, who pays those costs? And I think some of the far-seeing kind of proposals that are now on the table imagine a situation where the price of energy, either through a cap and trade or a carbon tax, begins to be assigned to the greenhouse gas weight of certain energy sources, and some of those monies get rebated back to consumers, or particularly lower income consumers who are hit more powerfully than other people with more resources, just to keep that idea in mind. So you've got it's why I called this book Carbon Shock. It's because I think actually a way to understand climate change is actually to understand it in the sense of the kind of shock that's being delivered to the natural system. The natural balancing act that occurs in the atmosphere has its corollary in terms of its impact on the economic order. And in writing this book, I went to all these different places around the world. I went up in an airplane and I talked about the sort of battle now between the United States and the European Union over how to assign a cost to the emissions coming out of airplanes, which is a significant contributor of greenhouse gases, and has given rise to essentially the first trade war you've never heard of between the European Union and the United States over how to handle those emissions, a battle that's going on right now as we speak, even though most people are not aware of it in this country, over this fundamental question of how you deal with emissions coming out of airplanes. I went in and out of the food-growing areas in the United States to understand the impact it was having on food, discussed the impact on, of course, this area in Spain that experienced this disaster with the Prestige, went to the Amazon to understand what it means in tropical forest countries, went to different cities to understand how cities begin to maneuver towards kind of low-carbon design, and ultimately also tried to understand what these guys doing carbon trading are doing, who some of you are familiar with through the cap and trade system. Anyway, so hopefully this book is kind of like a journey through that system. And the final words and image I'll try to leave you with is there's a fundamental process going on both within this country in terms of the price that businesses now face, the consequence. If you look at actually every major company is now trying to deal with the consequences of climate change. They're even further ahead than our own Congress is, for the most part. And our own United States Department of Defense now officially considers climate change to be one of the fundamental national security threats to this nation, partly because of the huge pressure that is being put on the borders of the United States as people are dislocated from their land in Mexico and Central America and elsewhere. The European Union has said the same thing because of the same phenomenon happening in Northern Africa. The response to climate change is beginning to actually take hold in different places around the world. We're all looking forward to what's going to happen in Paris in 2000 at the end of this year. I think what what these two maps I'd like you to just remember for a moment is to understand this idea. When it comes to, there were two maps that were produced last year. They're very interesting, revealing maps. One is by the World Resources Institute, which is a leading think tank in Washington. Probably most of them you have heard of. They actually showed a map of the most water-stressed agricultural areas around the world, right? And linked to climate change. And they basically have, it's an incredible map because it has these big red splotches across northern Africa, across southern Europe, across parts of Southeast Asia, across the kind of center of the Central America isthmus, and splotched there right in the middle is the Midwest of the United States, and a nice little etched, little jagged mark in the state of California. At the same level in terms of water threats as these other remote parts of the rest of the world. And there's another. So remember that when you think about where we are vis-a-vis the world. There's another map that is actually also really interesting. And that map was produced by the United States Department of Agriculture. And every 2 weeks, the United States Department of Agriculture issues a new map. It's a fascinating portrait because it's a county-by-county assessment of the indemnities owed to farmers for crop insurance as a result of crop insurance, crop losses. And every single county in America is on these maps. Most counties are in white, which means no indemnities because they don't have any farms. So it's most cities and stuff don't make it onto this map. But what's interesting about the areas that do get, in this case it's dark brown colors on the USDA map, dark brown colors in the USDA map, same places as the blazing red colors in the World Resources Institute map of water crisis areas. Same places, except this is only the United States. So you have the jagged, you have the heavy crop indemnities in where? The Midwest and the Central Valley of California. Why does that matter? That matters, one, because it means that you and I are paying the consequences of that extreme water stress caused significantly by the impacts of climate change. That's our money. And two, that the interesting thing to think of this internationally is that all those other farmers in all those other places around the world, they don't have a crop insurance. There's no government that's stepping in northern Sudan to actually start compensating farmers to stay on the land. So all these farmers that are in those areas of the thing don't get crop insurance. What do? They leave the land, and they begin migrating, and they begin moving, and pressures begin, and conflicts begin. And there's all sorts of studies about the intensification of conflict when it comes to climate change. So I want to leave you with that idea, number one, for two reasons. One is when you think of climate change, think of the stresses on public resources. Two, think of the growing international pressures and this kind of growing divide between this country and the rest of the world and the tensions that's going to create over time. And the fundamental process that suggests. So with that in mind, I know we're kind of running out of time here. I just wanted to leave you with some basic ideas. In the book, I go into some detail, and I try to tell these stories because actually what happens is that everywhere in the world, these battles are happening. People are becoming aware of these forces and trying to find ways to deal with the consequences of climate change. And I think it's clear, every economic study that's been done is that the money we put in now is going to pay far off down the line. It's going to be far less expensive than if we keep these emission trajectories going the way they are today. So with that, I leave you and hold on to this rock. Thank you.